Need to seed the crowd with some homers more often. That's good stuff, guys. Thanks for that. I am Josh Ward, VP of Sales at Nexcess. I started at Nexcess in 2014 and then had a short sabbatical, and then they acquired the company I was working for, so I came back. I think I've done a version of this talk for almost a decade now, so the X is a little off, but yeah, so 2014, 2023, there are a lot of the things that are the same from then until now when it comes to hosting considerations, right? What do you think about when you're hosting Magento? Some of that stuff hasn't changed, and we'll talk about that. Some of the stuff has. One of the notable differences putting this presentation together was that ChatGPT made putting this presentation together way easier. It was way less time than it was 10 years ago. In terms of agenda, things that we're going to cover are, if I were in a merchant shoes or in a developer shoes and I was looking to purchase hosting, or what do I want to think about when I need to make what I think, the second most important decision, where are you going to live, or where is your Magento store going to live? I'm going to cover what I would think about from my perspective, share that with you. We'll talk about best practices, cloud versus metal. I've got some key requirements there: scalability, security, support, and then S redundancy. Does anybody know what S redundancy is? It's what you do when you need alliteration in 4 S's and not 3, and so you throw an S in front of redundancy. That's what that is. And then it is 2023, so I'm going to talk about PWA briefly at the end. I think we can get through all this in about 15 minutes and then go hit the pool. You'll notice there is no mention of performance. This is the business track, not the technical track. I'm not going to get into server configs. I don't have time probably in 20 minutes to get to all of them. Also, there is a ton of great literature out there presented by Nexcess as well as other companies to tell you how to tune a server or your LAMP stack or whatever it is you're running Magento on, but how to tune it for performance and performance tips and tricks. But not 20 minutes, and I'm not your technical guy today. Best practices. What is a best practice to me? I am not in the Dwight Schrute camp of best practices. This is not right or wrong. There is no good or bad. I'm much more like on the pirate side of things. I'm going to give you some general guidelines. There's probably no bad choices. Everybody's site and situation is certainly different, and so you want to keep all those things in your mind when you're making this choice, and kind of weigh the pros and cons, right? Understand that there are trade-offs to rating ships, right? If you're going to go pirating, there's going to be some consequences, and so when you're choosing hosting, there's similar things, right? If you choose, we're going to talk about cloud versus metal in a second. But if you choose one over the other, it's not so much is one better, but it's what are you going to get and what are you going to give up. The importance of hosting, again, setting the stage a little bit here. I think that largely, like most things, are a partnership between hosting and the website, right? We partner with a lot of developers, and we think about a lot of that being very equitable, right? Our piece of the pie is very equitable to the developers or to the merchants piece, performance, security, right? We can't stop people from writing down credit card numbers or passwords on sticky notes and leaving them in Starbucks, right? So we can't control all the security things, but we can control some of them. So lots of partnership, but when you come to scalability and support, I think those are two biggies that you should really press your hosting company on, right? So as you're choosing hosting, as you're going through best practices, those are two things that I think you should focus on, and make sure you ask good questions and lots of questions before you make that decision, because I think the scales tilt more heavily into the hosting realm. Cloud versus metal. I'm really excited about this part. Let's talk about old versus new, maybe for a moment. The first thing, hopefully we don't have to say this too much longer, but I will continue to say cloud is actual physical hardware in a data center somewhere. It is still hardware, just like metal is, right? A dedicated server is a single box somewhere. Cloud infrastructure is multiple boxes somewhere in a data center. So in that sense, they are the same. Drives fail on both sides of the house. You can run a single cloud instance, a single VM, in the same way you can run a single dedicated server, or you can build about clusters. On the cloud side, you're probably going to end up with diverse pricing options, right? This is one place where they diverge. When you're buying a dedicated server, it's pretty straightforward, right? The market is pretty set, probably has been for 25 years or so. You're paying for resources. And then on the cloud side, you may be paying for resources. It may match your dedicated server pricing or bare metal pricing, but you may have some sort of metered pricing strategy, right? Or only when in use, or being able to spin resources up and down at a moment's notice, right? So your pricing sort of has to be different, or inherently is different, but that's one of those things that makes the two hard to compare. You have quick vertical scaling on the cloud side, right? You can take a virtual machine, you can make it bigger, right? That would be vertical scaling, make it bigger, make it smaller, but certainly be able to make it bigger, and you can do that very quickly. You can't do that with a dedicated server. You have to turn it off and add RAM, and then fire it back up, and that takes time that you may or may not have. So it's slow. You can do it, but it's slow, and so strategy there is make sure you have some headroom if you're looking for vertical scaling. Horizontal, that's a new word. Horizontal scaling in the cloud space can be super easy, but it can be really complicated, right? I put tricky up there because anytime you put auto in front of scaling, that's complicated, right? Whether you know it's complicated or not is another thing, but there are lots of mechanisms making all that automation happen, and sometimes that automation fails, right? Whereas horizontal scaling on the dedicated side, super easy, it's really straightforward, it's just slow, right? You're talking a day instead of hours or minutes in cloud land. Resource contention is still a thing. That's just a fancy way of saying when you're in a virtualized environment that has multiple payloads, right? It's running multiple applications for multiple customers. All those things are competing for a shared bag of resources, and sometimes that causes problems. Now, we've gotten way better at making that not the case, but there still is resource contention. Whereas you have a dedicated server, it's just you, right? There is no resource contention unless you put it there. Complex failure mapping in cloud, right? There's lots of redundancies to be had, but if you have to map to all the places that cloud could fail, I could be up here for an hour talking about just that, right? Whereas on the dedicated side, it's really straightforward. Now, there may be lots of single points of failure on the dedicated side, right? Instead of lots of redundancies, but much easier to map. So it's just a little simpler. And then lastly, I put kind of labor force and what is known, right? Advanced cloud technologies. There are fewer people out in the marketplace that know how to leverage those effectively and reliably than there are people who know how to leverage advanced hosting from a bare metal standpoint. That's just, in general, it's true because it's an older technology versus a newer one. Which one do you pick? I don't think you can make a mistake, or if you do, it's very much a Bob Ross mistake, right? You're gonna have a happy butterfly, right? You pick cloud and you're like, oh, you have some FOMO about not picking bare metal or dedicated servers. I think you're okay, right? As long as you made a conscious decision, right? You thought through it. I think you're going to be all right. I don't think there's a mistake there to be had. Freedom versus less freedom. That's the way I like to look at this. Essentially what I'm talking about are, platform as a service type of environments for Magento, of which there are a few, versus, traditional hosting, right? Whether you're doing it on your own, buying infrastructure from AWS or DigitalOcean or wherever, or a managed provider even, versus maybe an Adobe Commerce or something more along the lines of what WebScale does. Again, trade-offs, right? No code-based restrictions. You can do whatever you want to, versus code-based compliance, right? Following their guidelines or their roadmap. The trade-off there is like, how much trouble can you get in, right? When you have guidelines and you have some structure, probably less trouble, right? Versus when it's a little bit more Wild West, there's more trouble to be had. Do you have a deployment process for code, right? If you have that built into your system, then you maybe don't need to be told how to do that. But if you don't have that built into your system, then you probably want an easy button. More ownership, right? More ownership on the hosting side, traditional hosting side, just means more responsibility, right? Ownership is a fun way to say it, but that just means that you're responsible for more things. the promise of stability from a platform standpoint, right? It's consistent, it's more homogeneous, this works all the time, it never fails, which we all know is not true, right? But you have that promise of stability, which is good, versus being able to use all the extensions, right? You can use any of them from anywhere by any developer, right? From any point in time since 2014 maybe, which is not always the best thing. Some dashboard goodness, right? Does it look old and antiquated like cPanel versus does it look cool and new? Bundling your third-party systems like monitoring or your CDN versus having to go a la carte, right? Which may be better because you may not want to use this CDN that's bundled in. You may want to use this other one because you really like it. Fastly versus Cloudflare, right? You may want to be able to make that choice, or you're okay just with whatever's bundled. I think generally, just sticker price to sticker price, you're going to pay more for a Magento platform as a service option than you are for a traditional hosting option. But, right, the TOC there is total cost of ownership. And I used the wrong acronym. But, we'll go with TOC. Total ownership cost. So what does it cost you to build out your own dev process if you don't have the easy button, right? There's a cost there, at least in time, that you have to take into account as you're weighing both sides of the coin. So don't just think about what is the hosting cost, but what are all the other things, all the underlying things that I'm going to have to build into this in order to make everything work. That's really important. So it's not easy. It's not a straightforward choice. Key requirements, right? Here we get into the 4 S's. Scalability is the first one. Resources, right? Resources to me from a scalability standpoint mean, do you have them, right? So if you're on bare metal, do you have headroom? Are you going to have to shut the server down to add RAM? Those sorts of things. How big can you make a VM, right? Are there resources to double the size of the VMs that you're on? Or can you only increase them by 25%? Is that 25% enough? So resources still play a role. Load balancing when it comes to scalability, I'm sort of under the opinion that if you can afford it, because it's usually a little bit more expensive, but if you can afford it, you really shouldn't be running an e-commerce site on a non-load balanced solution, meaning load balancer out front that balances traffic over multiple web nodes of some kind, right? General load balanced architecture. If you're not doing that, you should, right? Things do go viral, TikToks do take off, you may get a flood of traffic. Even if you don't, there's some redundancies built in there that are really powerful. So I think, if you can afford it, go the load balanced route. Lots of cool things you can do there. Less is more, meaning in general, I think less complicated scaling is better than more complicated. So if you have some control over when things get bigger and when they get smaller, I think that is better than if something magic is happening behind the scenes to make things bigger or smaller. Again, just that auto piece is complicated. And then lastly, test and plan, right? Don't just assume that scaling works, whether it's auto or not. Know what you're going to do, what your process is, who you're going to call at your hosting company, or whose cell phone number internally you're going to call to make that happen, to push those buttons and pull those levers. But do that before you send out your first marketing blast to 1 million people, before you really spend $10 million this month on marketing, whatever it might be. Figure out how you're going to scale the site before you actually need that. Security, super important as well. Firewalls in all the places, right? I think CDNs that have some sort of firewall or filtering functionality, always better than ones that don't. That is a very general statement, but I think that's true. Patching and updates. Now I would say this requires that development process we talked about. Make sure your dev to staging to production works really, really smoothly so that you can patch your code, test it, make sure it's not breaking your site, and then go live very quickly, right? The faster you can get those updates pushed and those patches applied, the less likely it is to be exploited. So speed to market with patches and updates is really important. Access control from a hosting standpoint, right? Make sure that you pull your old employees off of your hosting account, right? That's a thing that they don't share one hosting password and username with everybody in your company. use VPNs to access the back end of your website. Access control, really important. We see a ton of issues with access control, right? Probably, I would tell you, our number one security pain point with customers is maintaining proper access control to their website and their hosting environment. And then finally, diligence, right? Security is the biggest pain in the ass in all of the things because it's consistent, right? You have to do it every day, every week, every month, all the time. And when you don't, something's going to happen. And the frustrating part, it's like 80% of security breaches or data breaches or whatever are caused by human error, right? It's not that the patch failed or that your firewall let bad traffic through. It's because somebody did something stupid, right? And so it's diligence across your organization consistently. So make sure your hosting company's doing that too, right? Is the point of having that on here. And then lastly, support. First off, make sure whoever you're getting hosting support from understands, LAMP and application. That gray area where the application and the server side software play together, make sure they understand that, right? That's where all the important things happen, and they can really be a partner to you. Phone a friend or phone a friend of me, right? Like, you don't always love your hosting company, but make sure you can pick up the phone and call somebody to expedite things, escalate things. That's really important. Greater than one subject matter expert. I don't know that I've heard two of these in the last couple of years, but certainly we have had customers come to us where the one Magento guy at the other hosting company was on his motorcycle heading to Sturgis, and he couldn't stop and get an internet connection to help troubleshoot whatever the problem was, right? So make sure whoever you're hosting with doesn't just have other Magento sites, but they have multiple people internally who know the word Magento and don't think you're talking about comic books, right? That's important. And then lastly, the migration piece, I think, is where the magic happens. So that relationship to set you up for long-term success happens during the migration, right? Tuning everything in the beginning, testing all the things in the beginning, understanding what the working relationship is. Again, regardless of whether you're hosting it yourself, you're working with a managed host, or you're on the platform solution, that migration piece is key, right? And should set you up for success long-term. So make sure that's buttoned up. And then the fourth S redundancy. There we go. So this to me comes down to two things: clarity and cache. I think are what dictate redundancy. So the first thing is, we get a lot of customers come to us and they say, hey, I want an HA solution. You need to be able to define what HA is for you, right? And the more HA or the more redundancy you have, the bigger your dollar bills are going to need to be, right? So understand that balance. HA can be, I've got RAID 10, a single dedicated server with RAID 10, 2 power supplies, 2 network cards, multiple PDUs at the end of rows, diesel generators out back in case the data center fails, right? There's some HA qualities in a setup like that. That's probably not what you mean, right? But I could be like, yeah, we got HA, right? I got plenty of redundancies in the back room. So what is it that you mean, right? You want a load balance solution so that one web server fails, the other one picks up the traffic. That's probably more in line with what you mean. Understand that you might have, single point of failure at your load balancer though, right? And to replicate your load balancer, that might cost a little bit more. If you want to run a cluster for your database servers, so that you've got real-time failover in some sort of Galera setup there, that's going to cost you more. That's 3 database servers instead of 1. That's going to cost you more money. If you want to replicate the whole thing from facility 1 to facility 2 at 70% of what facility 1 is, your costs are going to be significantly higher, right? If you want to do that. And then if you want real-time failover between facilities or between geographies, that's going to cost even more, right? So there's a very direct relationship in how much of HA redundancy, DR do I get, and how far do I take that? So just be aware of the relationship, and when you go in asking these questions, make sure that you sort of understand what you want, right? What's your threshold? What are your requirements as a business when you're talking HA? I think that's really important. Yeah, and then I don't have a PWA slide, so I'm going to go to the questions real quick, but I have 3 quick points. when it comes to PWA. One, whether you're using them or not, make sure your host can handle them, right? Especially if you're not in just like a, you're not just buying infrastructure from a AWS type provider. Make sure that they can install React and that's not a problem, right? Or how long that would take, or is that a different solution than what you're purchasing from them today? Because I think more and more people, we're seeing more and more customers move from non-PWA to a PWA solution, and sometimes that means another migration, and that can be painful. So make sure your host is ready and know what being ready means. Second, make sure you're talking to a developer. Hopefully everybody knows this, but we do sometimes get questions where people want to yeah, I'm gonna PWA Studio, I'm all in, right? Like give me the environment that's compatible. And if they're not working with the developer, that goes really poorly. So make sure you've got a great dev resource, whether that's internal or external. And then the third thing, and probably the most important to hosting, is don't assume that because you've implemented a PWA that your hosting infrastructure is going to be cut in half, right? That all of a sudden there's no load on your servers and you can have a much smaller one. I don't think that's typically the case. Now, you might not need a bigger one, but that core production hardware is still doing work, right? It's still needed at times to service all your traffic and your orders and your inventory and SKU changes and all that kind of good stuff. And so don't assume that PWA means less hardware. Again, that's one of those things that we kind of hear. That's my time. I think I'm a little over, so apologies. But questions? Perfect. Love y'all, mean it. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.